What was the detailed appreciation process that led to the formation of the independent companies, and how did that inform their role and their training program? We look at the formation of the independent companies and the birth of Australian Special Forces.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 50 of the Principles of War podcast, the Salamaua Raid, Formation and Training of the 2nd 5th Independent Company. So, this is episode 50 and we've hit a significant milestone. We've had over 200,000 downloads of the podcast, and I've been quite humbled at the messages I've gotten from around the world, from officers, from senior NCOs and students of military history about the podcast episodes that they've been listening to and what it is that they've got out of them. So a big thank you for everyone who helps share a Facebook post, retweets one of our tweets, or leaves a review on iTunes. All of those things help us to get the word out there about the Principles of War podcast. Today, we're starting a series on the raid in Salamaua. I think that there's a lot that we can learn about the tactical and strategic employment of special forces from the Salamaua raid. From the detailed planning, the reconnaissance, the complexity of the raid, and the impact that it had, there is lots to learn. And I'm going to use the Salamaua raid to compare and contrast with a couple of other raids. We're going to look at the raid on Heath's plantation and why that wasn't quite as successful as it could have been. And we'll look at a more recent British SAS raid and just why that raid wasn't as successful as it could have been, or completely unsuccessful, and what we can learn from that. Now, as we all know, selection and maintenance of the aim is the key principle. It is the prime principle of all of the principles of war. And I'm wantingly ignoring that as we move to Salamaua. We haven't yet finished the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Fear not, I'm definitely going to get back to that because I think it was a really important battle. There's still lots more that we can learn about it. We've delved quite deeply into the innovation and creativity piece around that. Particularly interesting doing that innovation piece with limited resources when in contact with the enemy. Lots that we can learn there, because my plan is to compare and contrast that with the Battle of Jutland. Lots that we can learn about the formation of training and mission command. So, onto the raid at Salamaua. For those of you who know anything about the formation of the independent companies, hopefully you found my dry sense of humour there quite amusing as I asked that initial question about the formation of the independent companies, because it was quite a troubled birth. Now, partially, it's important to remember that we didn't have the internet back then, we didn't have jet planes, so you couldn't easily get together and discuss how you were going to create independent companies in one of the colonies of the Commonwealth. So we need to take that into consideration. However, we also need to consider the lack of openness towards an innovative scheme, an innovative way of taking the battle to the enemy. And I think that was a big issue that as we delve into just exactly how the formation of the independent companies went, that is a significant problem. So the references for this series, I've read fairly widely on this. Some of the amazing work that Phil Bradley has done, so WOW 1942 to 1943 as a part of the Australian Army History Unit's campaign series. Also Phil's Battle for WOW. The official history, there's some quite interesting information in the official history. I've also listened to quite a few of the oral histories of those who fought in the 2nd 5th. And I'll reproduce some of those recordings just because I think it's really good to hear the stories as the soldiers themselves tell those stories. You can hear the emotion, and also they have some stories about the training and about the battle that you don't get. They really don't make it into many of the books. They don't make it into many of the unit war diaries, and they certainly don't make it into the official history. But nonetheless, really quite interesting and a lot that we can learn from them. We'll also look at Admiral William McRaven's theory of special operations. He's done some interesting work that looks at 6 principles for the employment of special forces. And lastly, but certainly not least, Gregory Blake's excellent book, Jungle Cavalry. He has detailed a lot of the operations that the independent companies conducted, and he's also done a really good job of looking at the training and formation of the independent companies. The concept for the independent companies came from Great Britain. After Dunkirk, Churchill railed against the lack of offensive action, and he was a key proponent for Special Forces direct action. If Britain was to fall, Churchill was keen for the formation of irregular forces from throughout the empire to strike back at the enemy. And this led to the establishment of British military missions in July 1940. Colonel Dudley Clarke worked on Sir John Dill's staff, and after Dunkirk he talked to Dill about the concept of a Boer commando type operation that would conduct amphibious raids against the European coast. This was presented to Churchill, and the next day it was accepted. Colonel Clarke had significant input in the formation of the commandos and the British SAS, and went on to be seen as one of the foremost authorities on strategic deception. As he recruited these people, he was looking for the dash of an Elizabethan pirate, the Chicago gangster, and the frontier tribesman, allied to a professional efficiency and a standard of discipline of the best regular soldier. There was a verbal agreement between General Sir John Dill and General Sir Brudnell White. So Dill had served as the GSO-1 at the Australian 1st Division, whilst White was a Brigadier General on the Anzac Corps staff. At this time in 1940, Dill was appointed as the Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, and Brudnell White had been recalled to service in 1940, and he was promoted to General and reappointed as Chief of the General Staff. It's important to think about just how dire the strategic situation was for people like General Sir John Dill. On June 15, 1940, when he looked at the prospects of a German invasion, he produced a memorandum advocating the use of chemical warfare against an enemy landing. The risk was that this would alienate the United States, and that it would also embolden the Germans to retaliate in kind. But he stated that at a time when our national existence is at stake, we should not hesitate to adopt whatever means it appear to offer the best chance of success. This is just how dark those times are. So Dill and Brudnell White have a discussion. White thought it would be a good idea for a British training team to come out to Australia and train independent companies. Now, White didn't tell anyone of the conversation, and he was tragically killed in the Canberra air disaster shortly after. And this tragic accident would have a significant impact on the formation and initial training for the independent companies. The plan was for the British to create a training team which would be sent out to Australia. That role fell to the Military Intelligence Research Department. This was a subsection of the British Military Intelligence Directorate. They created the 104 Military Mission, which was the training team to come out to Australia. It was headed by Lieutenant Colonel John Moorhood. There was only one problem with that. Moorhood wasn't actually a lieutenant colonel. He'd served in the army in World War I, but had spent most of the interwar years working for MI5. He'd been given the rank of lieutenant colonel because, as the head of the military mission, it was understood that he would need the rank of a lieutenant colonel to be able to conduct his role. Along with him, there was Captain Freddie Spencer Chapman. He'd been commissioned into the Seaforth Highlanders as a lieutenant on the 6th of June 1939. Chapman was a keen explorer and mountaineer. He'd attempted a climb on Mount Everest, and he'd also explored Greenland. After his time in Australia, he went to Singapore, where he worked at the Special Training School 101. STS 101 had the objective of forming stay-behind parties should Singapore be overrun by the Japanese. The plan was to use Indians, Chinese and Malays to form the stay-behind parties, but this was rejected by the British colonial governor, Sir Shenton Thomas, as being extravagant and defeatist. Chapman believed that if this had been done, it would have delayed the Japanese invasion for long enough for British reinforcements to arrive from Singapore, and that Singapore may not have fallen. His team formed a stay-behind party after the fall of Malaya, and he served in Malaya until 1945. He was the author of the famous book on jungle warfare, The Jungle is Neutral. One of the other trainers was Captain Mike Calvert. He had the nickname of Mad Mike. He was described as being a definite destruction fanatic. He went on to command the SAS and retired as a brigadier, having led a brigade of Chindits under Ord Wingate. The team arrived in Australia in November 1940. They came well equipped. They had over half a ton of plastic explosives, 50,000 maps and 36 Tommy guns. There was only one problem. The authorities weren't aware that they were coming. They were accused of being Nazi saboteurs because something just wasn't right about these newcomers to Australia. For starters, Morhood didn't act like a lieutenant colonel. Spencer Chapman insisted on wearing his regimental kilt, but he was from the 5th Battalion of the Seaforth Highlanders, and their kilt is different to the regimental kilt. Calvert had far too relaxed an attitude to the soldiers to have been an authentic British officer. The suspicion of the men only ended with the intervention of Major General Vernon Sturdy, the new Australian Chief of the General Staff. He was aware that the British trainers were coming out, but the British War Office later admitted that it was a mistake to not explicitly notify Australia of the team's incoming arrival. Mike Calvert was designated to find a place for the training camp. It needed to be somewhere near Army headquarters in Melbourne, and various places were looked at, but Wilson's Promontory ended up being selected. It had varied terrain, forest, scrub, mountains. There was Mount Oberon that could be climbed. There was also swamp. It also reminded them of some areas in Scotland, and the cold winters would be a very good famil for the training that they were doing and to prepare them for operations in Europe. Despite having incredibly talented and dedicated personnel in the training team, the development of the training program was quite problematic. Spencer Chapman himself said that they were so new and so shrouded in secrecy that no one knew their purpose or what they should be trained for. The Australian Army was reluctant to experiment and think differently, and there were significant elements who thought that regular infantry, with a little extra training and equipment, could do the exact same thing as the independent companies. Calvert thought that the likely enemy was to be Japan and that they would be doing guerrilla raiding, although many thought that they were to save Britain and that their operations would be conducted in Europe. It wasn't until May 1941 that Morhood wrote to the CGS that the independent companies were to be specially selected troops, highly trained and well armed, and used as assault troops to raid enemy lines of communications and conduct sabotage raids. This was 6 months after their arrival. Some of the problems in the training can be related back to institutional lack of interest in the program. The British had lost interest. Back in October 1940, the Military Intelligence Research Department had been folded into the Special Operations Executive, and the SOE was only interested in operations in Europe, and therefore operations outside of Europe received no interest whatsoever. Morhood wasn't really interested in the role of the independent companies. He was much more interested in his old MI5 type work, looking at fifth column and counter fifth column elements. There were scarce resources and little support from Army headquarters. In fact, the Chief of the General Staff told the British Secretary of Dominion Affairs that the Army did not wish to assume control of the 104 military mission as it was not in Army's best interest. It favoured the New Zealanders. There were actually 2 New Zealand companies being trained. There were concerns about the paramilitary and civil security intelligence roles, and concerns about an unnamed member of the training team. This was obviously Morhood. Blake, in his book Jungle Cavalry, describes rampant hostility against Morhood. The Australian Army thought that he was shirking his duties, and senior officers spread rumours that the real Morhood had been killed on the boat on the way out to Australia and had been replaced by an imposter. It was only the intervention of a very angry Federal Attorney General, Billy Hughes, that ended the controversy over Morhood. The 104 military mission was wound up on September 25, 1941. The plan had always been for the British trainers to train Australian trainers who would then take over the running of the training program. Both Spencer Chapman and Calvert were very disappointed at the decision. They'd both hoped to get commands of independent companies when they were fully trained. Spencer Chapman went to Singapore for the STS 101 training school, and Calvert went on to the Jungle Warfare School in Burma. The ties to Britain were still quite strong at this time, and the Australian Army hadn't felt confident enough to disband the independent company program prior to the leaving of the British personnel. Once they had gone, they felt free to be able to do what they had always wanted to do. The independent company concept was not an Australian idea. The confusion around the dual civil and military role created hostility and confusion, and there was no history of special forces within the Australian Army, and it was very difficult for the commanders to grasp exactly what they were needed for in the first place. They saw it as diverting precious resources away from forces that were already fighting. By this stage, the 2nd First had already been dispatched. They'd left the training camp in July to protect some air bases in northern Australia. They hadn't even completed their training. The 2nd and 2nd Third were left in limbo, and the 2nd Fourth had the majority of their personnel transferred to a light cav squadron. The 2 New Zealand companies were sent back to New Zealand, and they were disbanded once they got there. I think it's important to pause here and just reflect on the fact that the Australian Army was unable to envisage a role that independent companies would be able to play in any sort of strategic situation that may occur. This was an innovation that had been foisted upon them by the British. It was something that they weren't comfortable with and didn't see the resources being applied to the school down in Foster as providing a good enough return. I can't find a date that the school was actually closed down, but it will have been after September 25, so probably October, maybe even November. Of course, we all know what happened December 7, 1941. Japanese lightning attacks across a number of countries simultaneously creates a significantly deteriorating strategic picture for the Australians. Blake describes the parlous state of the army at that time. So the Australian Army had 132,000 AIF troops. The vast majority of these were in the Middle East. As far as their war establishments went, they had 74% of their small arms ammunition, 17% of their mortars, 25% of the artillery, 1.1% of the 2-pounder ammunition, only 73% of the rifles they were meant to have, 21% of pistols, and 49% of the light machine guns on hand. However, what they did have was the facilities and the training program for the Independent Company Training Centre, and it was reopened on Christmas Day, 1941, under Major Mac Walker. Blake describes this as rather than being an epiphany as to the possible role that the independent companies could be used for, it was actually a reflex action born out of desperation by the Australian Army. Australia was left grabbing for any resources available to meet the much expanded list of tasks with the entry of the Japanese into the war. One of these tasks was securing New Caledonia, a strategic island because it sits astride the sea lines of communications between the United States and Australia. Not only that, if the islands were to fall into Japanese hands, then the cities on the east coast of Australia would have been within range of Japanese aircraft. Australia's concerns about New Caledonia started in June 1940 with the fall of the French government and the creation of the Vichy government in France. Many French colonies had sided with the Vichy government, and New Caledonia had significant elements of Vichy sympathisers. HMAS Adelaide was tasked with going to Vanuatu and picking up Monsieur Henri Sato, a de Gaullist, and delivering him to Noumea, which it did on 19th of September 1940. In early June 1941, Captain Neen of the 2nd 4th Independent Company was sent to New Caledonia. He was given an assumed identity, that of Gunner Keane. He worked under Captain Charles Carty Salmon, the artillery officer, as a part of the military mission in Australia. Carty Salmon was the commander of a group of gunners who had installed 2 6-inch breech-loading guns on the top of a hill in Ansavata, overlooking Noumea Harbour. Neen acted as Carty Salmon's orderly clerk, but his job was actually to report on the local population, including a significant number of Japanese businessmen who were actually military officers who had been conducting reconnaissance around New Caledonia. He reported on local French sentiments as well as those of the indigenous population. He also assessed the capability for them to be trained as indigenous fighters. Neen produced a 36-page report which was very insightful to the human terrain in New Caledonia. We'll come back to Neen later in the training and recruiting of the independent companies and the actions at Heath's Plantation, where he was the commander of the 2nd 5th Independent Company. Following Pearl Harbor, New Caledonia became even more important, and it was deemed necessary to send a force to secure it. This task fell to the 2nd 3rd Independent Company. The 2nd 3rd arrived in Noumea on the 23rd of December 1941. Their role was to bolster the Free French forces in New Caledonia, to provide reconnaissance, to train local indigenous forces for their own defence, and, in the case of invasion, ensure that the nickel and chromium mines were destroyed, denying their use to the Japanese. If you're going to be posted overseas, New Caledonia is not a bad place to go. It's quite tropical, but there is no malaria like in many of the other jungle places that Australian troops would be stationed. The 2nd 3rd was sent with 6 months' worth of tinned rations. However, as far as logistic support goes, that was all that the 2nd 3rd was to get. There was no further food coming out for them, no further supplies, and even worse, there was no pay. It was impossible for the Australians to purchase anything. It was only when the Free French government agreed to pay them 2 shillings 10 pence a day in French francs that they were able to purchase local supplies. A radio network was established, allowing communications back to Australia. However, there were very few messages coming from Australia. The 2nd 3rd was left to feel like they had been dumped in a foreign colony, written off, and weren't coming back. The Australians were joined by American troops who arrived in New Caledonia on the 12th of March 1942. These were raw, inexperienced troops, and the 2nd 3rd made excellent instructors in jungle warfare for these troops. Independent company sections were attached to a number of the US companies as instructors. That experience went well, and the US headquarters requested a full course on guerrilla warfare to be conducted for US officers and NCOs by the independent company. Thoughts of Japanese invasion were never far from their mind, and during the 1st to the 4th of July, foreign-engine Japanese flying boats appeared over the island, and Japanese submarines were spotted close off the island as well. Attack was expected at any time. The independent company dispersed to the northern part of the island where they were responsible for the defence, and it was expected their role was to conduct the demolition of vital assets once the Japanese landed, and then conduct a guerrilla war against the Japanese and harass them for as long as possible. The 2nd 3rd Independent Company returned to Australia in August 1942. They were wearing American uniforms, they were carrying American weapons, and discipline had deteriorated significantly. They'd been subjected to 9 months of indifference from their high command in a prosperous and benign environment with minimal communications or material support from Australia. The fact that the 2nd 3rd had been left to its own without logistic support, without any oversight, and without any communications from Australia highlights the difficulty with which the High Command was having in dealing with the increased tempo of operations now that the Japanese had entered into the war, as well as indifference to the role that the independent companies were playing. Even after finding a task that the independent companies were perfectly suited for, the Army was still struggling to understand the role that they could play. Next week we'll come back and we'll look at the training of the 2nd 5th Independent Company as they set out on their road to New Guinea.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by Jane Zeeling. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.